December 7th, 1941, Washington, D.C., the White House. The afternoon light lay pale across the windows of the Oval Study, softened by winter clouds and the bare branches outside. The mansion was quiet in the way important buildings became quiet on Sundays, with footsteps muted by carpet, voices kept low, and clocks sounding louder than they should. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat with papers before him, his body held in the familiar discipline of a man who had learned to master pain in public. Across the room, aides moved with the careful rhythm of routine. Then the telephone rang. It was not a dramatic sound at first, just a bell cutting through the stillness, but the men nearby would later remember how quickly the air changed. The call came from Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox. His voice carried the shock of a message still forming as it traveled from the Pacific to Washington. Japanese aircraft had attacked Pearl Harbor. For a moment, the words seemed too large for the room. Pearl Harbor was not a newspaper headline yet. It was a living naval base, a fortress of steel and fuel and sailors, 4,800 miles away in Hawaii. Battleships lay there in neat rows. Young men were eating breakfast, writing letters, sleeping late after Saturday night liberty. Officers were looking over duty logs. Mechanics were checking engines under a clear island sky. Now bombs were falling among them. Roosevelt listened, his face tightening. The president had expected conflict somewhere, sometime, for months. The Pacific had felt like a wire pulled tighter and tighter. Japanese forces had advanced through Asia. American sanctions had bitten into Japan's oil supplies. Diplomats in Washington were still speaking in careful phrases, still delivering notes, still pretending there was time. But this was not a warning. This was an attack. When the first report ended, Roosevelt did not erupt. He did not shout across the room. His anger gathered coldly, with the weight of command. He understood at once that the world had changed. The United States had tried to remain formally outside the war, even as Britain fought for survival, even as Nazi Germany occupied much of Europe, even as American ships crossed dangerous Atlantic waters. That separation had ended in fire at Pearl Harbor. More reports arrived. Japanese planes had struck battleships, airfields, hangars, dry docks. Smoke rose over Ford Island. Hickam Field was burning. Wheeler Field had been hit. Sailors were trapped below decks. Ships were listing. Oil burned on the harbor water. The names came slowly, and then faster. Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Nevada. Inside the White House, phones kept ringing. Roosevelt called in his closest advisors. Harry Hopkins was nearby, gaunt and sharp-eyed, one of the few men allowed to see the president in unguarded moments. Secretary of State Cordell Hull was at the State Department, where Japanese envoys had been scheduled to deliver a message that now looked like deception. Military officers hurried through corridors. Clerks carried dispatches. Secretaries typed with stiff fingers. Every fragment of information seemed urgent, yet none of it was complete. The president asked for facts. How many planes, how many ships damaged? Was the attack still underway? Were the Japanese landing troops? Was this only Hawaii? Or had they struck elsewhere? The answers came in pieces, and some were wrong. In the first hours, confusion traveled faster than certainty. There were rumors of sabotage, rumors of attacks on the West Coast, rumors that the fleet had been destroyed, rumors that Japan had struck the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Midway. Some of those rumors would prove true, others would fade. But Roosevelt knew enough. The United States had been attacked by the Empire of Japan. In the study, as aides gathered around him, Roosevelt's voice cut through the noise. He spoke not as a stunned civilian, but as commander-in-chief. According to those near him, his first reaction carried a hard, bitter clarity. He said, "This means war." 3 words, No speechwriter, no podium, no applause. Just the conclusion that every man in the room already felt but had not yet spoken aloud. This means war. The phrase hung in the air like the first toll of a bell. It was not a question of whether Congress would act. It was not a question of whether the American people would understand. By attacking Pearl Harbor, Japan had done what years of debate had not done. It had brought the war into American homes, American newspapers, American churches, American factories, American ports. Roosevelt began preparing for the next day. He would have to speak to Congress. He would have to speak to the nation. He would have to take the grief, rage, and disbelief of December 7th and shape it into words that could carry a country into war, outside the White House. Washington still looked calm. Cars passed along the streets. Pedestrians walked under bare trees. Families prepared Sunday dinners. Radios played music, then interrupted with bulletins that made people freeze in kitchens and parlors from New York to Kansas to California. But inside the president's room, the first sentence of America's new war had already been spoken. This means war. December 7th, 1941. Late afternoon. The White House. The words had been spoken, but the work had only begun. This means war. In the rooms around Franklin D. Roosevelt, the machinery of government accelerated with frightening speed. Doors opened and shut. Uniformed messengers crossed polished floors. Telephones rang, were answered, rang again before receivers had settled. Each call seemed to carry another piece of the disaster from across the Pacific, and every piece arrived stained with smoke, oil, and uncertainty. The president remained at the center of it, steady but severe. He had spent years learning how to appear calm when his body was fighting him. Now that discipline served a different purpose, he did not need to look shocked. He needed to command. Maps were brought out. Hawaii lay in the center of the Pacific, no longer a distant paradise in American imagination, but a battlefield. The men around Roosevelt understood the geography with new urgency. Pearl Harbor was the anchor of the Pacific Fleet. If the fleet had been crippled, then Japan had bought itself time, perhaps months, to strike across the ocean before American power could fully answer. Reports continued to arrive. Battleships had been hit at their moorings. Aircraft had been destroyed on the ground before pilots could reach them. The Navy's great gray hulls, symbols of national strength, had been caught in harbor, vulnerable beneath the sudden scream of dive bombers. The Japanese had come in waves, torpedo planes skimming low over the water, level bombers releasing armor-piercing shells, modified for attack from the air, fighters strafing runways and barracks. Names of ships were repeated in tense voices. USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Nevada, USS Maryland, USS Tennessee, USS Pennsylvania. Each name was more than steel. Each was hundreds or thousands of men. Men in engine rooms and turrets, men on signal bridges and mess decks, men asleep below, men climbing ladders through smoke, men swimming through burning fuel, men trying to save shipmates they could hear but could not reach. Roosevelt listened, absorbing the scale of it. He knew the public would demand an answer. He knew Congress would demand an answer. He also knew that the wrong words, spoken in haste, could scatter the country's anger instead of focusing it. By evening, he gathered his advisers. Harry Hopkins, still weakened by illness, remained close, his mind alert despite his frail appearance. Secretary of War Henry Stimson arrived with military concerns etched into his face. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox carried the burden of the fleet's agony. Others came and went, including aides who would help shape the formal message to Congress. At the State Department, another drama had already unfolded. Japanese representatives, Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu, had come to deliver a long diplomatic note. Cordell Hull received them with controlled fury. The note did not declare war. It did not mention Pearl Harbor. By the time it was presented, bombs had already fallen. Hull, usually reserved and formal, told them he had never seen a document more crowded with falsehoods and distortions. The meaning was unmistakable. To American leaders, Japan had negotiated while preparing an ambush. This point mattered deeply to Roosevelt. It was not enough to say that the United States had been attacked. He needed the nation to understand the nature of the attack. It had come without warning. It had come while peace discussions were still in progress. It had come on a Sunday morning against ships and airfields filled with men who had no reason to believe they were already at war. That night, the president began shaping the address that would become one of the most remembered speeches in American history. He worked not as a man searching for ornament, but as a man searching for force. The speech had to be short. It had to be clear. It had to leave no room for hesitation. Roosevelt had delivered many speeches before, including fireside chats that entered American homes like a familiar voice beside the radio. But this was different. This was not reassurance after bank failures or explanation of policy. This was a call to war. A draft began with the phrase, "a date which will live in world history." Roosevelt changed it. He took up his pencil and replaced world history with a sharper word, infamy. A date which will live in infamy. The word carried moral weight. It did not merely describe an event. It judged it. It marked December 7th not as a tactical defeat or a diplomatic failure, but as an act of treachery that history itself would remember with shame. Around him, advisors watched the sentence harden into legend. The president then built the case piece by piece. Yesterday, December 7th. 1941, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the empires of Japan. He wanted the words suddenly and deliberately to land cleanly. Suddenly, because the attack had come without warning, deliberately, because this was not confusion, not accident, not a local commander's mistake. It was policy, it was planning, it was war. He would remind Congress that the United States had been at peace with Japan. He would say that the American government had been in conversation with Japan's government and emperor, looking toward peace in the Pacific. He would say that while those conversations continued, Japan had launched its assault. The room grew colder as night deepened. Outside, the city was no longer calm. News had spread. Radio bulletins interrupted regular programs again and again. In homes across America, families leaned toward wooden radio cabinets as announcers read partial reports from Hawaii. Some listeners thought first of sons in uniform. Some thought of ships they had seen in newsreels. Some thought of the old war in Europe and realized it had crossed the ocean at last. At the White House, Roosevelt dictated, revised, listened, and revised again. He did not need a long argument. The burning ships made the argument. The dead and wounded made the argument. The timing of the attack made the argument. He needed only to say what had happened and what must follow. By night, the first outline of America's answer had taken shape. It would not be a plea. It would not be a lecture. It would be a declaration of injury, purpose, and resolve. The president had heard the news as a private shock inside a guarded room. Now he had to turn that shock into a national sentence. December 7th, 1941. Night. The White House. The lights in the White House burned late. Washington had settled into darkness, but there was no rest inside the executive mansion. The attack at Pearl Harbor had not ended when the bombs stopped falling over Hawaii. It continued through wires, reports, rumors, casualty lists, and the sharp clatter of typewriter keys. Every message from the Pacific seemed to bring the smoke closer to the president's desk. Franklin D. Roosevelt remained at work. His face showed the strain now, but not collapse. The room around him had become a war room without officially being named one. Military aides moved in and out with dispatches. Secretaries waited for instructions. Advisors leaned over drafts. The president's wheelchair stood nearby, hidden from public view as always. Another reminder of the private battles he refused to let define him. In public, he would appear strong. In that room, he had to be more than strong. He had to be exact. The first casualty figures were uncertain. The Navy did not yet know the full cost. Some ships still burned. Some men were still trapped. Some officers at Pearl Harbor were still trying to understand whether another attack was coming. The vast Pacific was suddenly alive with danger. Japanese forces had not only struck Hawaii. Reports pointed to attacks or threats against Guam, Wake Island, Midway, the Philippines, Malaya, and Hong Kong. The pattern was becoming clear. Pearl Harbor was not an isolated raid. It was the opening blow of a wide offensive. Roosevelt understood what that meant. Japan had chosen a single violent hour to tear open the Pacific. It had aimed to cripple the American fleet, seize momentum, and force the United States into a defensive crouch, while Japanese troops and ships advanced across island chains and colonial territories. It was not only an attack on ships, it was an attack on American time. That thought sharpened the speech. The president did not want confusion. He did not want the next day's address buried beneath legal phrasing or diplomatic detail. The people listening in Congress and the millions who would hear his voice by radio needed to feel the direct line from event to consequence. The United States had been attacked. The attack had been deliberate. The nation would defend itself. The draft grew leaner. Roosevelt removed language that felt too heavy or abstract. He kept the sentences simple, almost spare. He knew how radio carried words. Long sentences could blur. Short ones struck. He had used that knowledge before in fireside chats, speaking into microphones as though he were sitting in the listener's room. But on December 8th, he would not be explaining a banking measure or asking patience through hardship. He would be carrying a nation over the threshold into war. He returned to the opening again. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The sentence moved like a drumbeat. Yesterday, the date, the judgment, then the blow. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. He chose words that made denial impossible. Suddenly told Americans that no fair warning had been given. Deliberately told them this was planned at the highest level. The phrase naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan identified the aggressor clearly. Not nameless aircraft. Not unknown raiders. Japan. The men near him understood the power of that choice. Roosevelt was not only describing history, he was preparing the legal and moral ground for a declaration of war. Still, he did not write as a man hungry for battle. He knew war too well. He had watched the First World War from inside government as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He had seen casualty figures, widows, hospitals, and graves. He knew that once Congress voted, boys in American towns would become soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen in a global struggle whose end no one could guarantee. Yet there was no alternative now that matched the facts. The attack had killed Americans on American territory. It had struck the Pacific Fleet while the nation was still officially at peace. It had made every isolationist argument feel suddenly distant from the burning harbor. For years, Americans had argued over whether the wars in Europe and Asia were truly theirs. Now the question had been answered by torpedoes. Roosevelt's anger remained controlled, but it did not fade. It entered the language. He would say that the distance from Hawaii to Japan made it obvious that the attack had been planned many days or even weeks earlier. That line mattered. It told the public that Japanese diplomats had spoken of peace while their carrier force was already moving across the Pacific. It gave the nation a story not merely of surprise, but of betrayal. In another part of the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt was preparing for her own broadcast. The The First Lady understood that fear was already spreading through the country. She spoke that night to Americans by radio, telling them that whatever was asked of them, they would accomplish it. Her voice reached homes where mothers were weeping. Fathers were silent, and children were being told to go to bed without understanding why the adults kept listening to the radio. The president's speech for the next day would be shorter and harder. He would not try to explain the entire war. He would not list every grievance in the Pacific. He would not ask for revenge in wild language. He would ask Congress to recognize a state of war between the United States and Japan. That was the center of it. Not a promise of easy victory. Not a boast. A recognition. War already existed because Japan had created it. The phrase was formal, but beneath it burned the harbor. As midnight approached, Roosevelt continued refining. Harry Hopkins remained close, a witness to the transformation of shock into statecraft. The president's aides saw that he was tired, but no one suggested stopping. There were documents to prepare. Congressional leaders had to be informed. Cabinet members had to be ready. Security concerns had to be addressed. Military commands had to receive instructions. The nation's armed forces, scattered across oceans and continents, had to move from vigilance to war footing. Outside, Washington slept uneasily. In newspaper offices, editors prepared giant headlines. In radio studios, announcers rehearsed updates with voices kept steady by force of will. In train stations and hotels, strangers repeated fragments of news to one another. Pearl Harbor, battleships, Japanese planes, heavy casualties, war. Inside the White House, the president looked again at the page before him. He knew that the speech would last only minutes. But those minutes would divide American history into before and after. Before. The United States had armed Britain, watched Europe burn, argued at dinner tables, and hoped distance could still protect it. After, there would be mobilization, ration books, shipyards, factories, training camps, casualty telegrams, and flags in windows. Roosevelt's pencil moved over the draft. The opening stood firm. Infamy. Sudden. Deliberate. The ending would be firm as well. He would ask Congress to declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, a state of war had existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. He did not need to say more than necessary. The ships at Pearl Harbor were still burning. Section 4. The morning America crossed the line. December 8th, 1941. Morning. Washington. Deep GC. The city woke to war before war had been declared. Newspapers hit doorsteps and newsstands with headlines so large they seemed to shout from the paper. Pearl Harbor attacked. Japanese planes strike Hawaii. Heavy losses feared. Across Washington, men in overcoats stopped under gray skies to read the first columns, their breath visible in the cold air. Streetcars rattled past government buildings. Soldiers and sailors moved with tightened faces. Civilian clerks hurried to offices where yesterday's peacetime routines had vanished overnight. Inside the White House, Franklin D. Roosevelt prepared to go before Congress. The speech lay ready, short enough to fit on a few pages, heavy enough to carry the outrage of a nation. Every sentence had a purpose. There was no time for decoration. The president understood the power of restraint. He would not thunder for an hour. He would speak for minutes, and in those minutes the United States would hear the legal and moral case for entering the greatest war in human history. Around him, aides reviewed final arrangements. The House chamber would be crowded. Senators and representatives would gather in joint session. Cabinet officers would attend. Military leaders would listen with the knowledge that words spoken there would become orders across the globe. Reporters would watch every movement, every pause, every expression. Radio networks were ready to carry the president's voice into homes, offices, barracks, factories, and cars pulled to the roadside. Roosevelt's body required careful preparation. He could not walk unaided. The effects of polio had left his legs useless years earlier, and the nation rarely saw the full truth of it. The men closest to him knew the choreography. Braces locked. Strong arms offered support. A cane placed correctly. A route chosen with care. In public, he would appear upright, determined, and in control. On this morning, that image mattered even more than usual. The country did not need to see frailty. It needed to see command. Before leaving, Roosevelt continued receiving updates. The scale of destruction at Pearl Harbor remained unclear, but the known facts were grim. The battleship Arizona had exploded and burned. Oklahoma had capsized. West Virginia and California had sunk or settled in the harbor mud. Nevada had tried to escape and was beached to prevent blocking the channel. Airfields had been torn open by bombs and machine gun fire. Hundreds were dead, then more than hundreds, then perhaps thousands. The final number would come later. The grief had already arrived. The president's jaw set as each report reached him. His speech did not need to change. The first facts had been enough. Now every additional detail only deepened the wound. He left for the capital with security heightened and tension hanging over the motorcade. Washington was alert to threats real and imagined. Rumors had run through the capital during the night. Enemy aircraft approaching. Saboteurs nearby. The West Coast under attack. None of it could be fully dismissed in the first fog of war. The Japanese carrier force had vanished back into the Pacific. But no one in Washington could know where every danger lay. At the Capitol, crowds gathered despite the chill. Some came because history was being made. Some came because they needed to be near the center of power when their country changed course. Police held the lines. Reporters pushed for position. Congressmen entered under the eyes of citizens who wanted action, not debate. Inside the chamber, the noise rose and fell in waves. Members of Congress filled their seats. Senators entered from their side. The galleries were packed. Every face seemed turned toward the same question. How would Roosevelt speak? What would he ask? Would anyone oppose him? Just one day earlier. The country had contained deep divisions over war. Interventionists and isolationists had argued with bitter conviction. Many Americans wanted to aid Britain and resist Axis expansion. Many others wanted no part in another foreign war. The memory of 1917 and the trenches still haunted families who had buried sons once already. Pearl Harbor had changed the argument. The attack had done what speeches and warnings had not. It had collapsed distance. It had made the Pacific immediate. It had made the war personal. When Roosevelt entered, the chamber rose. The sound swelled around him. Applause, chairs shifting, voices lifting, then applause again. He moved with visible effort, supported but controlled. His face grave beneath the attention of the room. Every step was part of the message. He was a president carrying physical limitation into a national emergency, refusing to let either weakness or shock govern the moment. He reached the rostrum. The papers were placed before him. Microphones waited. The nation waited with them. In living rooms across America, families leaned toward radios. In small towns, shopkeepers turned up the volume. In factories, workers paused beside machines. In military barracks, recruits stood in silence. Mothers held letters from sons stationed in Hawaii and prayed the names had not yet been printed. Fathers stared at the radio cabinets as if the voice inside them might tell them what kind of future had begun. Roosevelt looked out over the chamber. Vice President Henry Wallace sat behind him. Speaker Sam Rayburn presided nearby. Cabinet members and justices watched from their places. The president saw before him not merely politicians, but the constitutional machinery of war. He could command armies, but Congress declared war. The words had to pass through this room before they became the nation's formal act. He began, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The chamber grew still. The line struck instantly. It named the day as history before history had time to settle. It told every listener how the event should be remembered, not as a surprise alone, not as a setback alone, as infamy. Roosevelt's voice was firm, nasal, unmistakable. It carried the cadence Americans knew from years of radio addresses, but sharpened now by anger and purpose. He continued, saying that the United States had been suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. There it was. Suddenly, deliberately, the words landed like verdicts. He reminded Congress that the United States had been at peace with Japan and had still been in conversation with its government and emperor. The implication was clear to every listener. Diplomacy had been used as cover. While American officials received messages, Japanese pilots had already crossed the final miles toward Oahu, hands on controls, bombs secured beneath wings, torpedoes prepared for the shallow harbor. In the chamber, faces tightened. Roosevelt pressed on. He described the distance from Japan to Hawaii, explaining that the attack must have been planned many days or even weeks earlier. During that time, he said, the Japanese government had deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace. The sentence carried the cold fury of the previous night. It was the public version of what had been felt in the White House when the reports first arrived. This was not merely war. This was betrayal. He did not dwell on the burning ships. He did not describe sailors trapped below decks or oil aflame on the harbor water. He did not need to. Every American imagination supplied the images. The power of the speech came from what it held back. Roosevelt let the facts stand tall enough to cast their own shadow. Then he widened the frame. The Japanese attack had extended beyond Hawaii. The nation learned that Japanese forces had attacked Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippine Islands, Wake Island, and Midway. The Pacific was not facing a single wound, but a coordinated offensive. The United States was not entering a limited quarrel. It was stepping into a vast theater of war. The chamber listened without interruption. There were no serious doubts left to argue. The question had become not whether America would respond, but how quickly and how completely. Roosevelt's voice hardened as he moved toward the end. He said that no matter how long it might take to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might would win through to absolute victory. Absolute victory. The phrase was not casual. It promised that the answer would not be symbolic. It would not be a brief punishment or a negotiated gesture. It would be total national effort until Japan's aggressive power was broken. The members of Congress heard the future in those words, though none could yet measure it. Island battles, carrier warfare, submarine patrols, jungle campaigns, Marines on coral beaches, soldiers in the Philippines, shipyards working through the night, families reading telegrams under porch lights. 4 years of sacrifice waited behind the sentence. Roosevelt neared the final request. He asked Congress to declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war had existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The wording mattered. He did not say war should begin now. He said a state of war had existed since the attack. Japan had opened the door. America was now naming what had already happened. The speech ended. For a heartbeat, history seemed to hold its breath. Then the chamber erupted. December 8th, 1941, early afternoon. United States Capitol. The applause crashed through the House chamber like surf against stone. Franklin D. Roosevelt stood at the rostrum, the pages of his address before him, his face grave as the sound rose from the assembled members of Congress. Men who had spent months arguing bitterly over foreign policy now stood together. Senators, representatives, Cabinet officers, military leaders, and guests in the galleries understood that they had not merely heard a speech. They had heard a door close behind them. The United States was no longer watching the war from the edge. It was inside it. Roosevelt's words still seemed to hang above the chamber. A date which will live in infamy, suddenly and deliberately attacked. Righteous might. Absolute victory. The phrases had been chosen for radio, but inside the Capitol they carried the force of a sworn oath. The president had not spoken long, yet the shortness made the address sharper. It left no shelter for delay. Every listener understood the question before Congress. Japan had struck American territory, American ships, and American men. The government now had to answer with the full authority of the Republic. Roosevelt left the chamber with the same controlled effort with which he had entered. His aides stayed close, but he remained composed beneath the eyes of the nation's leaders. Cameras captured his profile, his dark cape, his firm expression. To the public, he looked like a commander-in-chief already facing forward, already moving past shock into action. Behind him, Congress moved quickly. The declaration of war was brought forward. The language was direct, because the imperial government of Japan had committed unprovoked acts of war against the government and the people of the United States. Congress would formally declare that a state of war existed. The words turned grief into law. They transformed radio bulletins, black smoke over Pearl Harbor, and the dead beneath Arizona's shattered decks into a national act. In the Senate, the vote came first. There was no long struggle, no drawn-out filibuster, no effort to dilute the meaning of the day. The senators understood that the attack had unified the country in a way no political argument could have. The chamber voted unanimously for war against Japan. Then the House voted. Only one representative opposed the declaration, Jeannette Rankin of Montana, the first woman ever elected to Congress and a lifelong pacifist who had also voted against entering the First World War in 1917. Around her, the chamber was filled with anger, grief, and certainty. Her vote stood alone, isolated beneath the weight of national outrage. The declaration passed with overwhelming force. The country's answer had become official. At the White House, Roosevelt signed the declaration. The pen moved across the paper, and with that motion, the United States entered World War II as a combatant. The decision had taken less than 24 hours from the first shocking reports to formal war. Across the Capitol, bells, presses, radios, and telephones carried the result outward. In American homes, families heard the news and sat in silence. Some fathers rose from chairs and walked outside, unable to speak. Some mothers went to bedrooms and opened dresser drawers where sons' letters were tied with ribbon. Some young men looked at one another and knew they would soon be standing in recruiting offices, in city apartments, farm kitchens, college dormitories, barber shops, diners, and union halls. The meaning spread with the speed of electricity. War, not a headline from Europe, not a debate in Congress, not a distant crisis beyond the ocean. War for the United States. Recruiting offices began filling almost immediately. Men came in wearing work clothes, suits, Letterman sweaters, and overcoats. Some were angry. Some were frightened and tried not to show it. Some had brothers in the Navy and wanted revenge before they even knew whether those brothers were alive. Clerks took names. Officers answered questions. Lines formed outside doors. Factories felt the shift as well. The country had already begun preparing, but now preparation became mobilization. Steel, rubber, aluminum, oil, copper, and labor were no longer merely resources. They were weapons before they had shape. Automobile plants would learn to produce tanks and aircraft engines. Shipyards would launch destroyers, carriers, transports, and landing craft. Women would enter industrial work in numbers that changed American life. Farmers would grow food for armies. Scientists would be pulled into secret projects. Children would collect scrap. Families would save grease, ration gasoline, and measure sugar. But on December 8th, those future sacrifices were still only shadows. The immediate emotion was Pearl Harbor. For many Americans, the attack existed as sound before it existed as pictures. The president's voice had entered their rooms, and with it came the image of burning ships. They imagined sailors running through smoke, aircraft diving through blue sky, men trapped below decks pounding against metal. Newspapers would soon print photographs, but the first national memory came through words. Roosevelt had given the country a frame for its outrage, infamy. The word did not fade after the speech. It appeared in headlines, conversations, editorials, sermons, and letters. It gave ordinary people a way to speak about something that felt larger than grief and sharper than anger. Pearl Harbor was not merely a military disaster. It was a moral wound. Inside the military, orders moved rapidly. The Pacific Fleet had to be assessed and salvaged. Surviving ships had to be repaired or sent to sea. Aircraft had to be replaced. Bases had to be defended against possible follow-up attacks. Commanders in the Philippines braced for Japanese strikes. Wake Island prepared for siege. Guam faced danger with little hope of relief. Across the Pacific, American servicemen heard the news and understood that they were no longer stationed in tense outposts. They were on front lines. The Navy, stunned but not destroyed, began gathering itself. At Pearl Harbor, rescue crews still worked in heat and smoke. Men cut through steel to reach trapped sailors. Divers descended into dark water clouded with oil and debris. Doctors and nurses treated burns, shrapnel wounds, and shock. Chaplains moved among the injured and the dead. The harbor stank of fuel, fire, and torn metal. The attack was over, but the dying had not stopped. No speech could erase that. No vote could bring back the men lost inside Arizona when her forward magazine exploded, or those trapped in Oklahoma as she rolled over, or those killed on airfields before they had time to fight back. But the speech and the vote gave the dead a national answer. Roosevelt knew the war ahead would not be simple. Even as America declared war on Japan, Nazi Germany remained the greater military power in Europe. Adolf Hitler watched from Berlin. Benito Mussolini watched from Rome. Winston Churchill, in Britain, received the news with a mixture of sorrow and grim relief. Britain would no longer stand as the only major power holding the line in the West. The American giant had been struck awake. Yet in Washington, on that December afternoon, the first enemy named was Japan. The first wound was Pearl Harbor. The first words of America's declared war had come from Roosevelt's voice, steady and cold with outrage. When people later asked what he said when he learned Japan had attacked, those closest to the moment remembered the plain sentence before the famous one: "This means war." It had been spoken privately in the first hard minutes after the call reached the White House. The next day, he gave the nation the public version, a date which will live in infamy. One sentence was immediate, spoken in a room thick with ringing phones and incomplete reports. The other was historical, written through the night and delivered beneath the gaze of Congress. Together, they showed the path from shock to decision, first recognition, then resolve. As the afternoon faded over Washington, the United States crossed fully into the conflict that had already consumed much of the world. There would be no return to the old arguments, no return to the illusion that oceans alone could shield the Republic. The attack had reached across the Pacific and into the center of American power, and Roosevelt, who had heard the first words of disaster through a telephone receiver, had answered with words that would send millions into motion. December 8th, 1941. Evening. Washington. Débat possible. The winter darkness came early over the Capitol. By the time lamps glowed along Pennsylvania Avenue, the United States was a nation at war. The words had passed from Roosevelt's lips to Congress, from Congress into law, and from law into the lives of millions. Yet the city did not celebrate. There were no victory parades, no bands, no easy songs of triumph. The mood was harder than celebration. It was anger held in discipline. It was fear turned into motion. Inside the White House, Franklin D. Roosevelt returned to work. The speech was over, but the war had only begun. The president, who had faced Congress that afternoon, now faced a desk crowded with decisions: military readiness, Pacific defenses, Atlantic convoys, industrial production, public morale, intelligence failures, Allied coordination. Every folder seemed to open into another crisis. The first question was survival in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had been wounded deeply. The battleships that once formed the visible strength of the Pacific Fleet were sunk, burning, capsized, or damaged. Docks were torn, airfields were wrecked. Aircraft lay in twisted rows beside runways that had been struck by bombs and bullets. Sailors were still being pulled from water, slick with oil. Some men were alive inside overturned hulls, knocking against steel in the dark while rescue crews listened with their ears pressed to metal. For the families waiting on the mainland, there was only dread. Telegram offices would soon become places of terror. Parents would hear footsteps on porches and stop breathing. Wives would watch mailboxes. Brothers would read casualty lists in newspapers with fingers trembling over the names. The full cost of Pearl Harbor was not yet known in Washington on December 8th, but Roosevelt understood that the first reports were only the beginning of grief. Still, the Japanese attack had failed to destroy everything. The aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet were not in harbor when the bombs fell. Fuel storage tanks, submarine facilities, and repair yards survived. These facts did not soften the tragedy, but they mattered enormously. In war, survival often hid inside disaster. The Navy had been struck, but not killed. The United States had lost ships and men, but it had not lost the ability to fight. Roosevelt would need that truth soon. Across the Pacific, Japan moved with terrifying speed. Its commanders had planned for momentum. While Americans mourned Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces advanced against the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, and other targets. Their strategy was to seize territory, build a defensive perimeter, and force the United States and its allies to pay in blood for every mile back. The president saw the map changing almost by the hour. Pins and lines marked places that most Americans had barely thought about before December 7th. Luzon, Manila, Wake, Guam, Singapore, the South China Sea. The names would soon become part of daily conversation. They would appear in newspapers, radio reports, letters from servicemen, and prayers spoken in churches. The war in Europe also pressed closer. On the other side of the Atlantic, Britain had endured the Blitz, submarine warfare, and years of danger. The Soviet Union was fighting Nazi Germany in a struggle of unimaginable scale. China had already suffered years of Japanese invasion. Roosevelt knew that America's war could not be separated into neat oceans for long. The Axis powers were connected by ambition, aggression, and opportunity. Pearl Harbor had brought America into the Pacific War, but the country was moving toward a global war. In the White House, aides saw the president's mind already working beyond the first blow. He had to keep Americans united after the first shock began to fade. He had to make sure rage did not dissolve into panic or prejudice. He had to turn volunteers, workers, soldiers, sailors, farmers, engineers, nurses, and factory managers into one national force. The words "absolute victory" would demand more than applause. They would demand steel poured at midnight, ships launched in record time, bombers assembled in long, bright factories, and young men trained to fight in places they had never imagined. The sentence he had spoken in private remained the simplest truth. This means war. But war meant more than a declaration. It meant families changing their routines, industries changing their purpose, and cities dimming their lights. It meant the selective service offices filling. It meant uniforms becoming common in train stations. It meant ration books, bond drives, victory gardens, scrap metal piles, blackouts, and casualty notices. It meant Americans learning the geography of loss. Roosevelt's leadership would be measured not only by how he began the war, but by how he carried the country through it. That task began with language. The attack on Pearl Harbor could have produced confusion. It could have produced wild rumor, scattered vengeance, or paralysis. Instead, Roosevelt shaped the first national response into two linked truths. The United States had been attacked without warning. The United States would fight until victory. His public words did not reveal every emotion in the room where he first heard the news. They did not show every private calculation, every flash of anger, every fear for the fleet, every question about what intelligence had missed. But the famous speech carried the moral structure of that first reaction. The private sentence, "This means war," became the public declaration that a state of war already existed. That is why the moment endured, not because Roosevelt invented American anger, but because he gave it a disciplined voice. Not because the speech was long, but because it was brief enough to strike like a hammer. Not because it explained everything, but because it made the essential thing impossible to miss. Pearl Harbor had changed the nation in a single morning. Before December 7th, many Americans still spoke of the war as something happening elsewhere, even as oceans narrowed under the pressure of aircraft carriers, submarines, and global alliances. After December 7th, distance lost its old meaning. The Pacific was no longer a barrier, it was a battlefield. The United States was no longer a nation debating whether war might come. It was a nation burying its dead and preparing to strike back. For Roosevelt personally, the attack became one of the defining moments of his presidency. He had led through depression, conflict at home, and growing danger abroad. Now he would lead through total war. His physical body remained limited, but his role expanded beyond anything even his supporters had imagined. He would become commander-in-chief of a vast military machine, partner to Churchill and Stalin, strategist of alliance, and voice of a country that had transformed overnight from anxious observer to arsenal and combatant. Yet the origin of that transformation remained painfully human. A Sunday telephone call, a room in the White House, the president listening as the Pacific Fleet burned, a few words spoken with cold certainty. This means war. Then, the next day, a nation listening as he said that December 7th, 1941 would live in infamy. In the years that followed, Americans would remember the speech as the formal beginning. They would hear recordings of Roosevelt's voice and feel again the gravity of that chamber. They would read the words in textbooks, see the photographs of battleships burning, and learn the names of places where the war carried American forces next. Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But before all those names, before the Long Island Road to Japan, before the factories reached full production, before the casualty lists stretched across years, there was the first realization in Washington. The president did not need a council to understand it. He did not need a long report. He heard that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, and he knew at once that the old world had ended. The United States would answer not with a raid, not with a protest, not with a temporary burst of anger, but with a war that would reshape the century. And in the silence after the first news arrived, Franklin D. Roosevelt gave the moment its simplest name, war.